Most Americans are very familiar with the early English presence in the eastern United States at places like Roanoke Colony, Jamestown, the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. From second, third grade in our history books, that's what we learn about American history. What's been left out of that picture is Spain's role in the colonization and settlement of the interior United States and the coastal United States.
Today, Exploring North Carolina is privileged to report on an extraordinary archaeological find within the borders of our state. It's the story of a Spanish settlement located near Morganton, North Carolina, a settlement that predates the earliest English occupation in North America by 2 decades.
It is a story of great scholarship, archaeology at its best, hot, dirty physical work, and luck. This is also the story of a great team, led by Dr. David Moore of Warren Wilson College near Asheville. I asked David Moore how he became involved in the search for Spanish settlements in North Carolina dating to the 1560s.
When I began to look at topics for my PhD dissertation research, there was a great deal of interest in the routes of the 16th century Spanish explorers Hernando de Soto and Juan Pardo. The new research that had been coming out since the early 80s indicated that these armies had passed rather than into the far western counties of North Carolina, Cherokee County and Clay County and Macon County. Instead, that they had come from the Wateree River Valley of South Carolina into the Catawba Valley of North Carolina. So what I decided to do was to determine if we had 16th century populations of native peoples in this region and see if they corresponded to the locations and the types of observations that were made in the Spanish documents. So I studied several hundred sites from Catawba County and Burke County and McDowell County and selected 3 to do my initial work on in 1986. And the Berry site was sort of the first one I settled on. It was going to be the major site at which I worked, and that's how I began here in '86.
Picking the Berry site from among several hundred was a stroke of genius and luck, because important finds were made in the very first year.
We learned an awful lot in 1986, and most importantly, we learned that indeed this was a town that dated to the mid-16th century. It was the right time period. It had an earthen mound, the remains of an earthen mound on it, which would say to us that this was a fairly powerful town. And we didn't have any direct evidence of Spanish presence. I didn't identify any Spanish artifacts that summer. I began to pick out, in my analysis of the pottery, I began to pick out pieces of pottery that were definitely non-native, and I had a dozen or so of them. And these were identified by someone else because I wasn't experienced with the non-native pottery. And this person suggested that they were probably 18th century Moravian. Rob Beck, who was also beginning to investigate these same issues around the Berry site, he found some pottery out here that was historic as well, and he took it to folks that were very experienced in Georgia with looking at this Spanish material, and they said that it was olive jar, Spanish olive jar. So Rob called me and said, I've got this pottery, it's been identified as being Spanish olive jar. And I said, well, it sure sounds like the stuff that I found that we've been calling the Moravian pottery. We need to check this out and see what it is. And Rob came to Asheville and brought his pottery, and we literally, you know, had my stuff in my hands and his stuff in his hands, and we compared them, and they were the same materials. In fact, it was pretty clear that we had pieces from the same vessel.
University of Oklahoma archaeologist and assistant professor Robin Beck remembers this meeting equally well, and he has even a longer association with the Berry site than David Moore.
I grew up about 20 miles west of here in Marion, North Carolina. And my aunt and uncle actually own this property that is the bury site. So since I was 6 or 7 years old, I have been walking the fields here, looking for arrowheads, looking for Indian pottery. And it's very ironic and very rewarding to be back here now as a professional archaeologist. In 1994, I came out to the site. I was thinking about graduate school, and I was looking for a sample of the native ceramics to compare with ceramics from another site, and I started finding this very unusual glazed European pottery that was unlike any European pottery that I'd seen before. So I kept that material separate and took it to the University of Georgia, where 3 archaeologists there, Mark Williams, David Hawley, and anthropologist Charles Hudson, all looked at it. And Mark Williams actually is the first one who said that this looks like European Spanish olive jar. Dave and I got together and we compared my material with his material, and as it actually turned out, I had some of the same fragments from a vessel that Dave had identified back in 1986.
And that was pretty exciting. And to further confirm that these were Spanish olive jars, we took that material to Santa Elena to see Chester de Prater and Stan South, who were working at Santa Elena. And they took one look at it and said, this fits perfectly with the material here at Santa Elena from the Pardo era. And we were just thrilled and excited. It's hard to describe the feeling that we now had firm evidence for Spanish presence here at the bury site. This is pottery that hadn't been traded to Indians. There's no record of them trading pottery like this with the Indians. This was pottery that would have been carried with the Spanish soldiers.
The histories of states are often deeply intertwined, and that is why Exploring North Carolina is on the campus of the University of South Carolina in Columbia. We are here to study Santa Elena, a Spanish settlement established in the mid-1500s on the South Carolina coast at Parris Island. Santa Elena served as a springboard for an attempted settlement in western North Carolina in 1566, almost 20 years before Sir Walter Raleigh's Lost Colony.
Renowned archaeologist Dr. Chester de Prater of the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology recalled that first meeting with David Moore and Rob Beck.
In 1995, when Stan South and I were digging at Santa Elena, David Moore and Rob Beck brought down some of the artifacts they'd been digging up on a settlement on the upper Catawba River drainage, and they wanted to look at those and to see if they were anything like the artifacts we were getting from Santa Elena. They suspected they were Spanish of the right period, and we looked at them, and sure enough, they were identical with the things that they were digging up, and clearly were Spanish artifacts of the mid-16th century, and it became pretty clear at that point that they were probably digging on Pardo's San Juan.
The Spanish pottery was important, but much more evidence pointed to Burke County as the site of the first European settlement or colony in the interior of North America. Chester de Prater was one of the first to link the early Spanish explorers to this area of North Carolina.
Hernando de Soto was a Spanish conquistador who made his fortune in the conquest of Panama, Nicaragua, and ultimately in Peru, where he was one of the lieutenants under Pizarro, who was the leader in the conquest of Peru. In the spring of 1539, he mounted an expedition into the southeastern United States in search of the kind of gold and silver he'd seen in Central and South America. He landed in Tampa Bay with about 600 men in May of 1539, and then over the next several years moved through all of the southeastern United States, including South Carolina, North Carolina. There are 4 written 16th century accounts describing the explorations of the De Soto expedition, and through the past couple centuries, scholars, especially historians and more recently archaeologists, have tried to track the route that De Soto took through the southeast. As more archaeological information and better maps have come along, we've been able to modify the route that we think De Soto took, and it was that work that led ultimately to the discovery of the real location of Fort San Juan up near Morganton, North Carolina.
But there was another bit of detective work by de Prater that helped pinpoint the location of Juan Pardo's Spanish settlement in North Carolina.
But the real key to understanding where Pardo went came when I was on a fellowship at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and I came across a reference to a longer document describing the expedition of Juan Pardo. And once we had that in hand, we realized that it gave very detailed day-by-day movements for the Pardo expedition. It allowed us then to figure out exactly where he had moved from Santa Elena up the Catawba River Valley through the interior, and ultimately to pinpoint the location of Fort San Juan and the Indian town of Juara where it was established.
The longer document Chester de Prater saw referenced in a Chicago library was elegantly written by a Spanish scribe named Banderas. De Prater was able to locate a copy of the important Banderas document at the Department of Archives and History in Raleigh, North Carolina. Following initial successes, David Moore put together a team of archaeologists that has continued to make discoveries at the Berry site. In addition to Rob Beck, David has teamed with Chris Rodning of Tulane University.
When I began this project, there were a couple of things that were important to me. I wanted to do this with colleagues. I knew that I would not be able to do it by myself, and I enjoy working with other people. And when Rob and Chris joined me on this project, that represented for me just an incredible opportunity. These were both young scholars with incredible potential that I enjoyed working with, and they were excited about this topic as I was. And so we all three of us had this idea that we wanted to be involved in a project that was not only significant but would provide an opportunity to involve the public, because one of the core philosophies that I operate by as an archaeologist is that this information that we learn deserves to be known by everybody.
I asked Chris Rodning, an assistant professor at Tulane University, the purpose of Juan Pardo's expedition and why Spanish explorers sought out native towns and villages.
Pardo's primary purpose was to take possession of the northern edge of the Spanish colonial empire in eastern North America. He attempted to do so by establishing several forts and related Spanish settlements in what is now the western Carolinas and even into eastern Tennessee. It helped the Spanish colonists at Santa Elena to get some of the men out of Santa Elena into the interior. Times were hard, supplies were low, and the interior was a region known to provide food and potential areas for settlement outside the Spanish colonial settlements on the coast. They would have marched from one native town to another. At this point, Spanish colonists in the New World, especially in North America, knew that large supplies of food could sometimes be found at the largest towns.
Rob Beck noted for us another important reason why the Spanish placed settlements in this area of North America.
One of the purposes was simply to get these hungry soldiers out of Santa Elena. The other purpose was broader in scope. At the time, Spain had some very important silver mines in northern Mexico, which is part of New Spain. And those silver mines, they were afraid, were susceptible to being raided, especially the galleons coming from those silver mines, were being raided by English pirates like Francis Drake. So Pardo's mission was to create a road, to construct a road that connected Santa Elena on the South Carolina coast with these Spanish silver mines in Mexico. Pardo and Menendez both believed that the mountain chain that they were seeing in northern Mexico was the same as the same mountain chain that they were seeing in the southern Appalachians. So they were essentially collapsing the North American continent and missing the Mississippi alluvial valley and the Great Plains. Menendez and Pardo both believed that once Pardo got across the Appalachian Mountains, northern Mexico would only be about a week-and-a-half hike away. So Pardo was to construct the road, build the garrisons, pacify the local Indians in the area. Again, Menendez's mission here and Pardo's mission was to create a permanent Spanish presence, and to do that they didn't need to antagonize native groups in the way that De Soto did. They needed to have alliances with native groups.
Both at the Santa Elena site at Parris Island, South Carolina, and at the Berry site near Morganton, there is much definitive evidence to show the presence of Spanish occupation. Written records and physical evidence reveal a serious attempt at permanent settlement.
What was happening here at the Berry site is unique and unusual because it's a colony. This is a Spanish colony where soldiers came in with the intention of living here and establishing this place as a Spanish place for a long period of time. In fact, when Juan Pardo built Fort San Juan, he renamed the native village here. The native village is called Jawara, but Pardo renamed it Cuenca after his own hometown in Spain. So this was not a fly-by-night operation, it was not a temporary operation. As far as Pardo was concerned, this was going to be a permanent Spanish presence in the interior. And to that end, the soldiers here were outfitted with the kinds of things that they would need as Spaniards, even though they were living in a foreign land. We know, for example, that Pardo brought in 98 liters of wine for the expedition. That wine was almost certainly carried in olive jars, which were kind of like the cardboard boxes of the 16th century, used for a lot of purposes. But that wine was brought in so that the soldiers could continue to take communion as good Roman Catholics while they were stationed here at the fort. We know that Pardo had 35 pounds of nails that he brought in with him for use not so much in building and joining large beams for the fort together, but so the soldiers could have the kinds of interiors in their houses that they were used to having in Spanish houses. We also have lead shot. We know that Pardo left about, I can't remember if it's 50 or 100 pounds of lead shot for the soldiers to use with the Spanish firearms. And we again know that neither olive jars, nor lead shot, nor nails were ever traded by Spaniards to the native groups, at least as far as the written documents go.
Chris Rodning told us of other significant artifacts in addition to olive jar pottery, lead shot, and nails.
The assemblage of 16th century Spanish artifacts includes tightly rolled brass beads or aglets, which would have been used as lacing tips for clothing. Glass beads that we know date to the 16th century, fragment of Capara blue mayalica, a form of painted pottery that we know dates to the 16th century. There are fragments of a form of pottery known as Mexican redware that have been found here at the site.
These artifacts tell us much about the Spanish soldiers and explorers 20 years before the Roanoke colony. They can also tell us about the interaction between two cultures. Ellie Haywood, a PhD candidate from the University of Georgia, runs the water screen at the Berry site. Here she sees the remnants of two very different peoples.
It gives us a chance to look at Spanish artifacts and Native American artifacts side by side and begin to see how Native Americans might have influenced the Spaniards living at the site and how the Spanish may have influenced Native American life at the site. Looking at the artifacts themselves and having this context from which to pull begins to give us a view into the lives of the people that lived here and understanding the interactions of the people themselves rather than just the artifacts in the ground. This is something that several southeastern archaeologists have called the forgotten century. This was a period before English colonization, and since we're all speaking English, those are the stories that get written.
Like Rob Beck, Ellie Haywood also has personal ties to this project.
Morganton has always been home to me. This is where I grew up. And it is amazing to me what was always so close to my own back door. It wasn't until I went to college, to UNC in Chapel Hill, that I discovered archaeology and discovered that this was my passion. It wasn't until I'd graduated that I discovered this site that had been worked on since I was 14 years old, 20 minutes from home.
When you travel to Morganton in Burke County, home of Senator Sam Ervin, who would guess that you are near the first interior European settlement in North America? Is there any doubt about the significance of this discovery?
It's nearly impossible to make statements archaeologically like we have proved that this is Fort San Juan. We have a body of evidence that is circumstantial at this point, but we consider it pretty compelling. that evidence consists primarily of this pretty good assemblage of Spanish artifacts. They're well dated to the mid to late 16th century. They consist of a wide variety of materials, several kinds of Spanish pottery, lead, copper aglets. The nails are very important. And we have the 2 small pieces of the iron wire that we suspect are chain mail. We'll never find a sign out here that says, you know, Juan Pardo slept here and this is Fort San Juan. But with this assemblage of artifacts tells us that it's artifacts that weren't traded to the Indians, that Spaniards used these on a day-to-day basis. It's an occupation site by the Spanish, where 10 years ago many of our colleagues would have wondered if we really have the fort. We've built this large assemblage now, and it's, I think, compelling to most of our colleagues as well. That there's no other good candidate. No one has come up with an alternative interpretation for what this site represents other than Fort San Juan.
Well, of the 5 forts that Pardo left in the interior, Fort San Juan is the only one that has been identified archaeologically. We know from our tracing of the route using documents about where the others should be, but they're very small outposts occupied by a small number of men for a short period of time, so archaeologically they'll be very hard to identify. It's one of the good things about David's work and on Fort San Juan is that they have found it, and they found it through fortuitous circumstances on Rob Beck's aunts and uncles' property. Other than that, it might have taken decades more of searching to find it, so that ultimately we may know more, but right now this is the one that we have and is a very exciting discovery that allows us to see what was going on in these interior forts in the 1560s.
How then did Fort San Juan, occupied in 1567 and 1568, affect the lives of American Indians and the later settlement of the Carolina Piedmont by the English, Germans, and Scotch-Irish?
It's even more significant than just our interests. It's emblematic of what was going on in the 16th century with colonial powers meeting indigenous peoples and trying to conquer them, in many cases conquering them. This happened all over North America. It happened right here. This is a time when those cultures are coming together, conflicts emerge, and here it had particularly tragic consequences, we believe.
We know that as the Spanish established settlements on the southeast U.S. coast and sent expeditions into the interior, that the European participants in those expeditions would have brought with them new disease that the local Indians had no natural immunity to. So things like chickenpox and measles and mumps and even the common cold would have infected the local Indians. So that this would have had pretty great effect on the Indian societies, and the interior population loss would have lost a settlement, abandonment, probably areas that had been home to large number of Indians would have ultimately become abandoned through time.
When the 18th century English settlers moved into the western Piedmont, it was virgin territory to them. They didn't have to deal with the Spanish or the Indians. And had the Spanish prevailed and held the Carolina Piedmont in the 16th century, or if the Indians had expelled the Spanish and been able